everyone, so today I wanted to try something a bit different out. I essentially want to take you along through the entire creative process of creating a painting. It is, of course, Halloween week, and naturally I have given myself less than 2 days to come up with something Halloween-inspired content and artwork-wise. And so that's what this video is going to be. For the last couple of weeks I've had this kind of specific image in mind of kind of this like gothic, vampiric scene, which I just happened to have found the perfect reference photo for, so that's kind of where this whole process is starting. I kind of just wanted to really do something like vampiric for the season, and I just randomly happened across this particular photo, and I thought it was going to be absolutely perfect to kind of use as a base point for this idea. I do want this to be like a fully background illustrated painting, and because of that I'm actually going to be using these watercolor artboards. It's actually my last one in this pack, hence the very measly looking packaging right now, but I love these. I did a whole slew of commissions on these that are kind of the same idea, like fully illustrated background with watercolor and colored pencil, and so that's kind of going to be the look that I'm going for this piece, and so that's why I wanted to use these, because they're awesome. They're essentially like watercolor board that has been mounted to like a hard surface. As you can see, it is super thick, and so these really do not warp. You can put them through a lot. The most they do is kind of just curve up like a slight bit, which obviously you could minimize with some tape, but because they are such like a high quality and substantial material, you don't actually need to tape them down, which means you can do a full illustration from edge to edge. And so yeah, that's kind of the beginning of this painting. Obviously I have like the rough idea in mind and the medium that I'm planning on using, so now I'm actually going to be doing a digital sketch. So this is the rough mock-up that I have for the piece right now. I wanted to do it digitally just because it is more of a complicated piece, and because it's like a full background illustration and everything else. I just wanted it to be digital so I can like mess around with things and like gradually build the detail and stuff, other than I plan on doing this on a watercolor artboard, so it's going to need to basically be transferred anyway, so there's no real sense in why it being traditional to begin with would be beneficial. Like I mentioned, this is what I have going on right now. If you're wondering, this is an iPad Pro 2nd generation, I'm pretty sure, and it's just Adobe Sketch. Just because it has my custom brushes in it, and that's just what I've been using for the last couple of years for kind of any of these sketches and stuff, and pretty happy with the program and everything like that. So as you can see, you have the like two characters, I guess you'd call it here. I didn't, like, obviously this is a really rough, like, just kind of gesture drawings, trying to figure out all the little details and stuff right now. It is, like, I didn't change too much posture-wise from the reference photo. Like, normally I might possibly, like, change up, like, this hand gesture, but I actually really like the hand gesture for this picture. I want this to be kind of like a vampiric scene, and I think, like, the one finger on the chin is very, like, teasing and, I don't know, interesting gesture. This character I want to be definitely, like, you will definitely be able to, hopefully be able to tell that this is like a vampire character. This character might be a little more up for debate just because like her head is like turned away more, so whether or not you'll actually be able to tell any defining features, whether I decide to make this character another vampire character or not, who knows. So that's what's going on here. And then I was figuring out kind of just roughly the background details. Obviously normally this would be a pretty dark image, but I want to like inject a bit of like color and light different ways. So how I'm going to do that is I have right now the original plan, obviously this might change, but right now I have these individual kind of candles down here, like a stupid amount of them, just because I think it's going to look cool and I can do some really interesting light effects with the watercolor and stuff. And it'll also cast some interesting light. So kind of obviously this could be very black and like very pale and deathly and typical vampiric. But I want this to kind of tint more towards like orange and purple. So obviously these candles are going to be emitting a very warm glow across the characters and just kind of, you know, the flames themselves and around them. And hopefully there'll be, you know, a lot of purple like injected, just kind of the reflection of the lighting and stuff around here. Anyway, I have a bunch of single candles down here because I want these characters to be pretty well lit. I just thought, you know, this effect would be interesting, but I also felt like over here was pretty bland. This is the 9:12 ratio, so this is like a 1-to-1 scale drawing basically. Like I'm not going to need to worry about cropping anything. This is accurate to the ratio of how the final will be. So I put like a really up close look at like a candelabra, like very roughly. Obviously I want to like detail this out a lot. Just because, you know, you want to look like you're within the scene, so kind of not just looking like, oh, everything's off in the distance. I figured this candelabra would be interesting. Same idea with the curtain here. I thought of, just because I'm not entirely sure, especially with the lighting situation, how much of like a background you're going to really be able to see. It might be pretty bland or just very minimal, especially like right in this area. So to kind of make something come a little closer, I've added these like curtains kind of like on like a covered bed idea, I guess you could say, and also I have a candelabra over here that will in theory be possibly matching whatever I come up with for this design. So like a 5 candle candelabra, tall one there. So I have like a curtain here in the foreground and then one more in the background, kind of covering them and framing them over here. But yeah, because I'm not entirely sure really what's gonna go on here, I'm gonna like research some kind of like Victorian-y gothic vampiric backgrounds and kind of figure out that. But like I said, because of the lighting situation, it really might be fairly minimal. You know, like obviously this candelabra is going to emit some light and kind of, you know, show what's over here, but I definitely want them to be the main focus. So this might be very minimal, especially with the possible like lens flare or glow of these candles. It's really going to kind of block out anything that's kind of going on behind there. When I started to refine the sketch of the characters, I actually basically drew up everything except their hair. I went back and forth a lot with the hair. Originally, I actually completely drew up the upper character that's kind of sitting up's hair like completely, and I had originally made it curly, and I was kind of debating over, you know, at this point I was thinking about colors as well. I did want them to obviously look different, but again, the lighting I had in mind was very dramatic and it was going to pose an interesting challenge. So I decided to ultimately make the character on the bottom's hair curly and the character that's sitting up straight. So kind of a 180. I just thought that the curly hair kind of around the lower character's shoulder would look very interesting. And I also at this point basically had decided that I wanted both of their hair to be white or silver, just because it was going to reflect the lighting really interestingly, which again was kind of also thinking about the like texture or style of the hair. I didn't obviously want the hair to blend in with the super dark backgrounds, so that's why ultimately pretty much why their hair was silver, other than it's just a really cool look. And as you can tell, there is a lot of hair, but I really enjoy drawing hair, and it was covering all the different bits because that was kind of the other thing, is that I really couldn't decide on clothing. You know, obviously the background is very Victorian era-ish. I mean, kind of what you can see, it's very like gothic Victorian-like. And the clothing was just a factor that I didn't really want to think about too much, other than just the lighting situation and how that would reflect. I wasn't feeling clothing with this one, but I wanted to keep it G-rated so that the extra hair covering everything also helps a lot. And of course, what you just saw me do there, the other awesome thing about digital sketches is the whole like copy paste and move around aspect that you can do digitally as opposed to traditionally. So I created a nice symmetrical candelabra that also matches the one in the front. So this is where I'm going to be stopping with the sketch. I didn't do that much detail in the candle area here just because obviously the candles are pretty simple shape and overall they might be more you know, created with just the watercolor, and you know, they really don't need too much of a sketch, and they're just really not necessary to be working on like super detailed wise. Like, I rather just draw them again by hand instead of worrying about transferring them like very specific candles onto the actual board. So yeah, that's kind of where it's looking right now. So I'm going to go ahead and print this off so that we can actually start transferring it onto the watercolor board. So here I have the digital sketch printed out. Now, this is going to be a 9 by 12 inch painting, but I always just print it out on an 8.5 by 11 paper. Sometimes if there's more detail, and if it was a bigger piece, I would go larger, but because most of the detail is essentially getting cut off because of the shrunken size, is like really nothing crazy important. I did kind of skew it so that this corner was basically full and you were losing more of like the curtain and stuff. Obviously much easier to redraw than possibly like this. So not worried about the lost detail. Obviously I have the digital version still that I can use as reference to redraw anything that gets cut off. But now I'm going to transfer this on to my artboard. So I'm using this transfer paper. I have a giant roll. It's the Sorel stuff, I believe. I have a giant roll of it, and this is just one of the extra cut off pieces that was in my drawer. So I'm going to use that, and one of my like main tips and kind of tricks for using transfer paper is I always use a ballpoint pen. Normally I would use one of the cheap ones like that, you know, just a normal cheap one that has like the ink has run out or whatever, because the ballpoint pens, like the nibs won't break on them, so you can really get nice consistent pressure for the transfer. But because this drawing is a lot more detailed, I am using this Staedtler yellow pen. It's older. I really don't think the ink even works in this anymore, but it is yellow, so I'm not using it for anything anyway. So this has kind of become my go-to thinner transfer pen. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get this transferred on to the illustration board. Depending on the like type of transfer that I'm doing and kind of the requirements and parameters of what I'm transferring, sometimes I use masking tape, but for this one obviously I'm using some drawing clips just clipped around the edges, and then of course going in with my thinner ballpoint pen and actually starting to trace over all of the digital sketch lines to then transfer it onto the artboard. I think a lot of the time when people use transfer paper, they forget that the tool that you use to actually transfer the sketch ends up being the line thickness that you end up with afterwards. Now that the rough kind of outline of the sketch is transferred, I end up going in with some sort of pencil and either adding detail or just in general refining it. The transfer paper, depending on what material you're transferring onto, does tend to smudge a bit, so just kind of going over any of those lines with a pencil of your choice does help the smudging a lot. It does depend on what you're transferring onto, like I said. Something that's like a wood panel or something tends to smudge less than if it's paper. It just really depends on what you're using, but I'm normally going over and adding detail and kind of fixing any areas up with a pencil anyhow. And for this sketch, because there was a bit more small detail, I was using a 0.3mm mechanical pencil. Now onto the actual coloring and painting part. I'm starting off with kind of roughing in the areas that I want to be the glow and light of the candle. So just with like a light wash of this yellow color, just on all the parts that I think I want highlighted by the flames and light of the candles, I decided to put in first because essentially those are the areas that I'm pretty much going to be avoiding basically throughout the rest of the painting process. This painting basically ended up being pretty much just 4 colors. Of course, you have the muted yellow color of the candles and the flames. I mixed up this kind of grayish purple color that does get significantly darker. Obviously, I'm building up layers. And then the drapes in the back ended up being like this kind of plummy, magenta-y, muted color. I forget what color it's called. It's a Daniel Smith color that I really like. And then the sheets ended up being a more darker, like true red than the drapes were, but eventually they kind of started looking like a very similar color. So that's kind of where the whole color palette was. Right now, obviously, it looks a lot more like more than 4 colors, but eventually I kind of just pulled everything back into like a more selective color palette to try and keep everything nice and cohesive. Because the lighting situation was so dramatic and really out there, I definitely was taking my time a lot more with this than I might have normally. So really just gradually building up the different colors and the darkness. I knew basically the only area that I knew 100% needed to be pretty dark was the back drape area behind the one character. But other than that, obviously everything was kind of subjective to thinking about how the candles and flames would react and interact with the characters and the environment. And of course, because I am using watercolor, you know, you really can't go back from being too dark, so building up your colors gradually is always a good idea. And because I was planning on using colored pencils afterwards, I was kind of just treating the watercolor as kind of a toned layer, you know, figuring out all the colors that I wanted, and just helping out, like, tone the background basically, because I knew I could add back in any darkness and detail that I might not be able to achieve as easily or as fast with the watercolor with the colored pencil later. At this point, the only area that I was really feeling was the back candelabra and the drape area, so I kind of started using and thinking about those color schemes and trying to use those colors elsewhere. So I ended up using the magenta-y color on the actual characters, and just like I mentioned before, just really trying to bring back the color palette to all look cohesive. The white hair idea ended up being an interesting challenge as well, because obviously the white is not going to appear white in this lighting situation, but you also don't want to add too much of the surrounding color to make it not look white and look like they have, you know, purple or yellow or whatever colored hair. So it's definitely a delicate balance, which hopefully I ended up achieving decently by the end of this. At this point, I was basically just trying to tone everything up, you know, get that base color down to start actually putting the colored pencils on the piece. And I was also kind of concerned about the candles at this point. Obviously, you know, the flames are interacting with the actual candles themselves, especially in this lower area, so you don't want to add too much detail, especially because I don't want them to be the main focus, but you want them to be able to still look like candles, and so it was this whole interesting challenge. And now, of course, is on to adding the actual colored pencil. I did make sure that the entire painting was very well dried before I went in with the colored pencils. You do not want to try coloring on wet paper. It does not end well. And for this, I actually stuck to just using my polychromos. The only one I grabbed of the Prismacolor eventually was a white, just because Prismacolor white is the whitest of the white for colored pencil wise, and because these guys had silver white hair, it really needed that extra pop of white color that the polychromos white just doesn't get to. I'm a really big fan of the whole watercolor and colored pencil combination. It just to me seems like kind of the best of both worlds. I get the, you know, cool effects of the watercolor where I need it, but I don't have to spend like kind of a stupid amount of time worried about the specific details, and it's just much quicker to go in with the colored pencil for certain things. Like obviously the hair strand detail is much easier achieved with a pencil than it is a paint and paintbrush and all of that kind of stuff. You know, just the idea of building up the color gradually and almost more swiftly, kind of contradictingly, than you would with paint, because, you know, it's just faster and you can see the immediate result of what the colored pencil look like, as opposed to with the paint, you know, you have to wait for it to dry. It looks darker when it's wet and you're kind of just balancing back and forth constantly. This is around the time where the flames really started being an interesting challenge, especially in the upper corner. Obviously, that whole candelabra area is not supposed to really be too in focus, and therefore the flames themselves are very kind of blown out and, you know, very bright and not really a shape, very, you know, kind of an abstract shape. But of course there's the wall behind it, and there was this like rough mirror kind of picture frame idea that I had, and, you know, those flames are not really, you know, they're not at all lighting up that frame, but they are in front of it. And same idea with the candles in the bottom, you know, the glow of the flame itself needs to be the main focus. So the colored pencils really helped with achieving that easier. And here is the final piece. Let me know if you'd like to see more of these kinds of videos, you know, going completely right from the beginning, planning stages of a piece right up until the end, and seeing and hearing about the process in between. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.